He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. It's been a week of international turmoil, with Trump firing up trade tariffs, turning off the tap for US aid everywhere, and even proposing to turn Gaza into some sort of Riviera resort, or something. But we've also had a sudden surge of headlines here about diplomatic disputes of our own over our relations with the US, Mexico, the Cook Islands and Kiribati.
How serious is this?
It's totally silly.
This week we look at all that and how the media ended up in the middle of it.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced retaliatory tariffs against the United States, a move which marks the beginning of a trade war between the neighbouring countries. President Donald Trump introduced the 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada and a 10% tariff on China at the weekend, claiming they're meant to stop drugs and undocumented immigrants.
That was the story RNZ's morning report kicked off with on Monday. In line with the rest of the world, Trump's fast-track tariffs kickstarting a possible trade war, which would definitely end up affecting us as well. But by then, some of our diplomats and trade negotiators had already been deployed on a more surprising diplomatic issue, inflamed by one of Trump's key Republican allies.
Ted Cruz said it's difficult to treat New Zealand as a normal ally within the American alliance system when they denigrate and punish Israeli citizens for defending themselves and their country. Now, our Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, quickly responded also on social media, calling the story fake news and saying the New Zealand government had demanded that media outlet to have that story corrected.
TVNZ's Logan Church on One News that same day with a story with the media at the heart of it. What Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters condemned as fake news had been published last week by Israeli media outlet Haaretz, which has a reputation for independence and credibility and even ignoring the Israeli government and its defence forces with its revelations at times. But Haaretz had wrongly reported that Israelis wanting a visa to visit here now had to disclose their service in the Israeli Defence Forces under what were described as new requirements, but no they don't, said Immigration New Zealand. Though it was too late to stop Senator Ted Cruz amping it up on social media, which in turn made many more headlines. And on Monday, a former diplomat and trade envoy Charles Finney told Morning Report that this showed the real danger of fake news these days. However,
well, I believe that the offending article out of Israel has been taken down. I don't know about Senator Cruz.
But did they get that closure and clarification? Well, sort of, eventually, but not entirely. And I took a look at that and how the story came about in the first place on this week's Midweek Media Watch. We also looked at tributes to Jonah Lomu and Marianne Faithfull, which missed the mark this week, and two reports on transport, which didn't, and also how the long suppressed name of a political figure finally came out in the media, and some fact-checking of the lousy summer so far. If you missed Midweek Media Watch on Nights with Emile Donovan last Wednesday, you'll find it on the Media Watch podcast page at rnz.co.nz, or it's available for free on any major podcast platform. Now, Senator Ted Cruz amplifying Haaretz's misinformation last weekend also turned out to be a bit of a bummer for the Prime Minister Christopher Luxon because, as the Herald's political editor Claire Trevett reported, he had met with Ted Cruz and others during a visit to Washington DC last year to, in his words, build direct relationships with him. Didn't seem to help in this case. But Winston Peters, on the other hand, has been praised for doing just that since he got the Foreign Minister's job in 2023, and the media have reflected that as well. 2 weeks ago, for example, Wellington's daily The Post reported that the Council of Trade Unions' annual Mood of the Workforce survey rated Peters as the best minister in this government, an endorsement Winston Peters was happy to put on his own Facebook feed. And last October, the Herald's annual Mood of the Boardroom survey, which takes the temperature of the nation's top bosses, also rated him. Indeed, the Herald's head of business, Fran O'Sullivan, reported that several even called Winston Peters the best foreign minister New Zealand has ever had, and among them, Windfarms NZ's Craig Stobo, who rated Peters as
an impressive saddlebag to National's bike. Great on rebuilding our global relationships, great on his focus on the needs of New Zealanders, not their identities.
Though Mexican New Zealanders might beg to differ on that latter point. After fellow New Zealand First MP Shane Jones had bellowed "Send the Mexicans home" at Green MPs in Parliament last week, Winston Peters himself told two of them they should be more grateful for being able to live here. And on Facebook, Winston Peters wasn't exactly backing down.
New Zealand First won't sit back and allow the Green Party to turn this country into a woke, globalist, totalitarian state with their extreme policies. Nor will we sit quietly and be lectured on the culture and traditions of New Zealand from people who have been here for 5 minutes.
And while Winston Peters was at it on Facebook, he criticised media outlets for not holding other political parties to account for their inflammatory claims. Now there, Winston Peters was speaking as a political party politician and not as foreign minister, but the Mexican ambassador complained to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade about it and said he'd raise it face-to-face with Peters at Waitangi this week. Though reporting from Waitangi last Tuesday, TVNZ's political editor Mikey Sherman said that all that seemed to be the end of the so-called Mexican standoff.
Now, you will see this photograph of Winston Peters and Ambassador Bravo at the luncheon. They're smiling. I'm told it was a warm meeting and that the issue has now been settled. I'm also told there were no tequila shots, as Shane Jones promised earlier in the week. But of course, the night is still young. Shane Jones has his traditional annual Treaty of Waitangi party at his house tonight. Perhaps the ambassador might make a brief stop in.
Well, there were no reports of any further informal diplomacy over tequila shots at Shane's place later on. But just one day after that, news of another diplomatic drama broke on TVNZ's One News.
We begin tonight with exclusive details of a deal that could shatter New Zealand's close relationship with a Pacific neighbour. The Cook Islands is set to strike a major partnership agreement with China, causing deep concern. The move would be a big win for Beijing, which is trying to exert its influence and power across the Pacific. It's also taken our government by surprise, a potential breach of constitutional arrangements between the Cooks and Aotearoa.
TVNZ's Pacific Affairs reporter Barbara Driva reported that the Cook Islands were about to sign a partnership agreement in Beijing, in spite of the terms of its free association with us under a partnership agreement. And the apparent secrecy surrounding all this was a big problem for the Foreign Minister Winston Peters.
And what clarity? And at this point in time, we have none. No clarity at all as to what this means. The Cook Islands is entitled to make those decisions themselves, but we've got past arrangements, constitutional arrangements, which require consultation with us, and dare I say it, China knows that.
And the Cook Islands Prime Minister Mark Brown then told Barbara Driva that early TVNZ news revelations had caused them a big problem on the question of citizenship and Cook Island passports.
We were caught by surprise when this news was broken by One News about our high-level discussion, which I thought was a high-level diplomatic discussion with leaders, to be open, frank in our discussions, for it to be brought out into the public before we've had a time to inform our public, I thought was a breach of our political diplomacy.
And it was only last week that Barbara Driva had another scoop for TVNZ One News about another Pacific Island state whose relationship with us was suddenly also under strain.
One News can exclusively reveal our relationship with the Central Pacific country of Kiribati is at breaking point, with the government taking serious action against the island nation. New Zealand's $100 million aid program there now on hold. The move comes after President Tanis Mamau pulled out of a pre-arranged meeting with Winston Peters last week.
That was TVNZ One News back on January the 27th. Now, the media were caught in the middle of the blame game over this one too, though much of our media didn't really see it coming, according to Sunday Star Times National Affairs editor Andrea Vance, who said this in the paper last weekend.
Of all the squabbles Winston Peters was expected to have this year, no one picked it would be with an impoverished, sinking island nation. A diplomatic rift with Kiribati was on no one's 2025 bingo card.
The people of Kiribati may not be thrilled with that description of their island home, but earlier on Morning Report last week, Corin Dan had said that Kiribati could lose out on more than $100 million in aid over it.
Mr Peters' office says the government is reviewing its development program in Kiribati after President Tanis Mamau pulled out of a meeting in Kiribati that had been months in the making, saying he was no longer available to receive the New Zealand minister.
Now that sounds serious and also pretty undiplomatic, so Corin Dan ended up asking Winston Peters this about that controversially cancelled meeting.
Do you believe is Kiribati snubbing you?
You can come to any conclusion you like, but our job is to try and resolve this matter, and we've made it very clear that we cannot go forward with budgetary planning of the level of support that we have given unless we have got an ability to, on the ground, discuss and talk to them about how the system is working.
After that, Kiribati's Education Minister, Alexander Tiabo, told RNZ there really was no snub. He said President Mamau, also the Foreign Minister, was unavailable because of a long-planned and very important Catholic ordination ceremony on his home island of Onatoa, shortly before the planned visit from Winston Peters. And on Facebook, New Zealand-born Kiribati MP Ruth Kwas-Kwansing blamed media-manufactured drama, and she meant the media here.
The New Zealand media seized the opportunity to patronise Kiribati, and the familiar whispers about Chinese influence began to circulate.
Now, she was a little bit more circumspect on 531 PI's Pacific Mornings radio show, but firm nonetheless that there was no snubbing.
It was sort of lost in translation with this in this particular instance. So, of course, we can work it out.
Meanwhile, back here on News Talk ZB, the Drive Time host Ryan Bridge was also pondering what to call this dispute.
I know that the media was calling it a spat, and now the Education Minister from Kiribati, the government there, is calling it a tiff. A tiff doesn't quite sound as bad as a spat, does it?
And Ryan Bridge also came down firmly on the side of Team Winston.
If somebody is giving me $100 million and they ask for a meeting, I will attend. I will drop. I don't care if it's my mum's birthday. I don't care. I mean, I wouldn't care if it was, somebody's funeral. I would be attending that meeting.
And his guests on the opinion segment The Huddle, including PR professional Trish Sherson, were also pro-Peters.
It was always very hard to pick apart these kind of stories just reading them in the media. But what I would say is that I have faith and confidence in Winston Peters as our foreign minister.
And former Labour MP Stuart Nash echoed that.
He's the consummate diplomat. If Winston says this is the story and this is what's happening, then I believe him 100%. And I would say go hard, Winston, represent our interests well, because he always does.
Yeah, I tend to agree with both of you.
But less than 1 hour later on News Talk ZB, veteran Pacific journalist Michael Field didn't agree at all.
How serious is this?
It's totally silly. And all this talk about we'll cancel $104 million of aid is pie-in-the-sky twaddle from Winston Peters.
That Catholic ordination ceremony was a big deal, said Michael Field. China's ambassador to Kiribati was there, and New Zealand should have been there too, he reckoned.
Somebody's lost their marbles on this, and the one who's possibly on the ground looking for them is Winston Peters. He didn't need to be in Tarawa in early January at all. Kiribati has got lots of problems, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be taking serious notice of it, but this is pathetic. This is like saying I was invited to my sister's birthday party and now it's been cancelled.
Now, that's not a comparison you hear very often in international relations. Now, that interview, curiously, has since then vanished from the website of News Talk ZB and its podcast feed. But on his own Substack newsletter, Michael Field insisted that the row reflects poorly on New Zealand. Yet, according to Barbara Drever, Kiribati was hugely disrespectful. In a TVNZ analysis piece published last weekend, she said New Zealand has every right to expect better engagement than it's been getting over the past year. Now, Barbara Drever was born in and grew up in Kiribati and has family there, and she also said she was disturbed by what she called the airtime and validation that Kiribati MP Ruth Kwas-Kwansing got in our media, especially as she was trying to blame our media.
She supports and is part of a government that requires all journalists, should they get a visa to go there, to hand over copies of all footage and information collected.
And just to dismiss the geopolitical implications of China was naive and ignorant, Barbara Drever went on to say. Well, Ruth Kwas-Kwansing then hit back at her on Facebook, accusing Barbara Drever of publishing inane drivel and irresponsible journalism causing stress to locals. And then she got pretty personal.
You write like you need a good holiday somewhere happy. Please book yourself a luxury day spa ASAP.
Now, 2 days later, last Tuesday, the government of Kiribati made an official statement for the first time, which said that the New Zealand government had effectively cancelled its own proposed visit, and it pointed the finger elsewhere as well.
Despite this media issue, the government of Kiribati remains convinced the strong bonds between Kiribati and New Zealand will enable a resolution to this unfortunate standoff.
So the media, again, copping the blame. Now, one who knows what it's like to cop blame for reporting stuff that the diplomats and politicians don't want in the news is RNZ Pacific's senior journalist and presenter Lydia Lewis. Last year, Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese even questioned RNZ's ethics after Lydia Lewis had reported comments that he had made to the US Deputy Secretary of State at a Pacific Islands Forum function in Tonga, which revealed an until then behind closed doors plan for the US to pay for better policing in the Pacific. Now, Lydia Lewis has also been covering the unresolved tension with Kiribati lately, so I asked her if the heat was coming more on our media these days if they candidly report diplomatic differences in the Pacific.
There's no study that says there are more people blaming the media for this and that, but definitely both the public saying, oh, the media are this, and politicians also saying, oh, the media, making a big deal about this. But on the story of Kiribati, I'd just put the question back to the public or to the listeners as to who's manufacturing drama. Winston Peters' office saying, oh, we could have gone about it differently. Potentially that answers your question. I mean, all we're doing is reporting what's in front of us for the public to then make their decision and questioning it. And there were a lot of questions around this Kiribati story, which I guess we'll get to a bit later. We got a message at 3 minutes to 6 o'clock from the government source saying, this is info for select journalists. And our morning reporter, Caleb Fotheringham, received this message. So I just contacted Peter's office, received a response, and called a Kiribati minister.
This is confirming that the meeting had been cancelled, this message you were getting.
That's right. This is confirming the meeting had been cancelled. Thank goodness I had a cell phone number for a government minister who I'd met the year before, and I called him. He actually didn't know anything about it, and that came of a surprise to me because the news from the foreign minister's office seemed really significant. And so for this high-level government minister who had represented Kiribati at a leaders level at the Pacific Islands Forum the year before, not to know anything about what Winston Peters had just sent out to media was a bit of a surprise. But between getting a response from Kiribati and, this initial release that we got from New Zealand, there are evening shows that need to go out across New Zealand and the Pacific. There's a massive breakfast show. So we didn't have a response, or any media, when I say we, until the following day. And that response is what I got from Kiribati's education minister. Winston Peters' office said that it was the Kiribati president who bailed, which is true, but it was not mentioned in that initial government release that Kiribati had offered the deputy president, the same person that met with Australia.
So in general terms, like politicians and diplomats, of course, would prefer to do things behind the scenes. A media exposure of what they're doing is a complication for them. But on the other hand, say, just to take one example, this week, TVNZ, Barbara Drever reporting on the impending partnership agreement between China and Cook Islands. I mean, we simply wouldn't know about that if that wasn't reported, right? And, it could be all in place before anyone, either in Cook Islands or New Zealand, had had a chance to think about what it means.
Yeah, that's right. Look, it is our job to report the facts. If we get a statement, we're going to report on it fairly and accurately.
And also, one interesting fact about this Kiribati affair, if I can call it that, some really pointed comments between politicians and even journalists on Facebook, and personal and a bit emotional. When you're reporting Pacific relations and diplomacy, the fact that people are prepared to make much more undiplomatic and blunt comments on Facebook, is that revealing when it comes to Pacific affairs and the tensions, or is it a bit of a distraction?
It is revealing in the sense that where does this person stand? Sometimes you pass it off as they're just putting their opinions out there, or maybe they've got some sort of motive, or that's their experience. And then if we get a message, sort of a formal message or an email, we'll take that a bit more seriously. And some of the things on social media we just take with a grain of salt.
But we heard how perhaps those pundits on ZB were all saying, look, Winston Peters is respected across the Pacific. He's a great foreign minister and we have total confidence in him. I mean, that's just some people giving their opinion on one network. But for New Zealanders trying to work out whether New Zealand's acted appropriately here, do you think it can give people the wrong idea? And also, for example, we have journalists disagreeing here. Michael Field giving a completely different take to Barbara Drever.
It is vital that we, as members of the public, look at multiple sources. So when a story like this, which is massive not only for New Zealand but for the region, and I would argue, on the world stage, it is important to have a read of some different sources.
Yes, because the story has developed, hasn't it, over more than a week, whereas, it tends to be covered by some other networks. It might just burst up when it appears to be controversial and then you wouldn't hear from it again or find out how it had been resolved or perhaps how other parties in it responded.
But is that just human nature? We get what we know out there, and that's maybe part of how the truth or shades of the truth comes out. People like Barbara Drever are amazing in the way they report on stories and, listening to that sort of, One News's coverage, which has been absolutely great.
Yeah, Ruth Cross-Kwan-Singh, the MP and Minister for Kiribati, she was really dismissive of media commentators just kind of pointing to China, leaping to the assumption maybe that this was all about diplomatic rivalry, China, Taiwan and so on. Barbara Drever, in her kind of pushback on the TVNZ website, wrote that it's actually naive to ignore it. And, a few days later, there she is reporting on Cook Islands about to do a partnership deal with China, even though they have a partnership agreement with New Zealand. So are we now in a time where we really do need to understand the big picture sort of geopolitics, but also be aware maybe not everything's because of Chinese intervention or involvement?
Yeah, it comes back to balance and knowledge and understanding what you know about and what you don't know about, and then asking the questions in between. In this situation, Kiribati has made it clear that China is not the driving factor of the so-called TIF. They changed their diplomatic protocols, but we didn't know this in the beginning, and that's maybe where the confusion came from.
On that theme, though, the description in the Sunday Star Times, Kiribati, impoverished sinking island nation. It's got a big economic zone. It's strategically, geopolitically important beyond its own land
Do
mass.
not underestimate Kiribati and the power of Kiribati, because there's a lot of people that wants in on Kiribati's huge exclusive economic zone. Like, it's massive. You may just see sort of sinking atoll or whatever on the news, but Kiribati is powerful in the sense of its geostrategic placing. So there's the connectivity point in Kiribati. There have been calls from people in Kiribati for greater support from the New Zealand government when it comes to applying for visas, for example, because it can take one day to send an email because someone needs to take a boat trip from one place to the next, and then they have to go back another day just to read the response. So it's just intricacies like that that are important to be aware of. But to call Kiribati that, I don't know.
It was in a piece about the diplomatic row. I mean, there was a lot of background that did consider the wider geopolitical issues and made it clear that Kiribati is, more important and significant than that.
I don't want to give Kiribati a free pass here. It has been incredibly tough to get a response, from them. They're only posting statements on Facebook, and it really has raised some questions for some journalists in our team around Tanes Mamao's government's commitment to transparency and accountability. We do have a fuller picture now of the Kiribati New Zealand situation, but the overarching question that's come out of this from journalists in our team is around transparency and accountability, because we can't do our job. We can't hold Kiribati politicians to account like we do New Zealand government politicians to account when we have Winston Peters on the show and question him hard on issues. But we need to be able to do that for politicians in Kiribati. That is our role.
The New Zealand media is being accused of media manufactured drama. You would say, you and your peers in New Zealand media media well, it's hard to get the undramatic response, the official response from government officials in the timely fashion.
Yeah, that's right. And despite, the connectivity issues and all that, we have a job to do, and that is to question them and in a timely fashion as well. Because if it's not timely, I guess it does get a bit more dramatic. Not because of us. We need transparency and accountability across Pacific media space, particularly for journalists who are focused and committed to fair media reporting across the Pacific.
That was RNZ's senior Pacific journalist and presenter Lydia Lewis. Last week, on our first Media Watch of this year, we heard about the latest job losses in journalism at the New Zealand Herald, a sign of the very tough times all news media companies are facing this year. And that followed the Herald's owner NZME closing or selling 14 local and community papers in the North Island just before Christmas. And in some of those places, they were the last weekly papers left and employing the only professional reporters there. And that raised fears about so-called news deserts springing up in some of our towns and regions. And one of those was Horowhenua, where NZME closed the Horowhenua Chronicle, which was established in Levin way back in 1893. So long and thanks for all the fish, editor Janine Balbergen told readers in the last edition just before Christmas. Now, in its heyday, the Chronicle was a 6 days a week broadsheet paper commanding a cover price. Since COVID struck in 2020, though, it's been a free weekly paper, but still with an office, an editor and a reporter in Levin. The rival weekly, Horowhenua Mail, was shut down by Stuff in October 2022. But this year, the Chronicle has continued under new management, publishing 4 editions already, edited by a former reporter, Ashley Collis. So, how was this done? Well, what was teased as a mystery buyer turned out to be ad sales guy Richard Christie. And when TVNZ One News visited recently, he told them this in a report that was aired on Waitangi Day.
When I looked at the financials, I saw that the paper was still profitable and could support 4 full-time jobs.
And it's no mean feat to create those jobs in local news in this media climate. But it wasn't just the Chronicle under new management that drew TVNZ's Kushla Norman to the region.
Plus, in an age when newspapers are meant to be dying, I'll tell you how the town of Levin has ended up with 2 weekly papers.
A second new weekly paper has indeed hit the streets there, the Horowhenua Star. Editor Ian Carson was shown on One News delivering the first edition last week to mailboxes by hand and then handing out copies on the main drag. 15,000 copies are being printed at the Beacons presses in Whakatane each week and then being delivered all around the region. Ian Carson said his paper is hyperlocal, and you can't get more hyperlocal than his existing one, Otaki Today, a monthly online publication that the former Evening Post reporter ran from his family home there, with a lot of help from the family, as Hayden Donnell discovered in 2023 when he popped in to check out the local media scene.
To what extent is this a family operation? I think there's a lot of Carsons on the masthead when I flick through.
Yeah, our contributor list does seem to stop at C.
Ian Carson's Horowhenua Star is edited by Paul Williams, recently the editor of the Manawatu Guardian, which was another victim of the NZME pre-Christmas closures. The Chronicle's former editor Janine Balbergen has also joined the Star, along with its sales representative Pip Hakaraya. But the Chronicle's new owner Richard Christie told One News that the town might end up being not big enough for both of them.
Yeah, in all reality, I don't think it can. Like, having looked at the financial statements, I hate to quote Succession, but it's a fight for a knife in the mud.
Well, we'll see, but Levin locals told One News on Waitangi Day they love having 2 to choose from.
We're privileged. Absolutely brilliant.
Good news, yep. 2 perspectives on issues, I suppose. It's an interesting concept for such a small town, to have 2 local newspapers, but I think it's going to be good for this for the area.
Another of the papers that NZME closed at Christmas time was the Taupo and Turangi Herald, and at that time, Jesse Archer from the local music station Lake FM told Mediawatch he was really worried about the town having no more journalists. So could Lake FM step in?
So Lake FM's quite a modest operation, and we don't have huge amounts of resource in terms of staff and whatnot to be able to go and do these things, but we're hoping to change that.
Well, this week, Jesse got back in touch to say, He's done it. We've brought on local journalist Chris Marshall to write news, he told us, and we've launched a modest local news service with weekday morning bulletins on Lake FM, 89.6 FM, and Timeless Taupo, 106.4. And some stories also feature on our new website, he said. That's lakefm.nz. And Jesse's too modest about that website. It's excellent. And just like in Levin, they've now got company. Dan Hutchison, the former editor of NZME's now closed Taupo and Turangi Herald, has launched Taupo and Turangi News with the slogan, reporting local, supporting local. Whoops, we made a newspaper, he wrote on its website, comparing the creation of the new paper to a not entirely planned pregnancy. And like a new baby, everyone wants a look. The Taupo and Turangi News is available free in print every Thursday and online all the time at tauponews.co.nz. Congratulations and the very best of luck to all these new news outlets defying the trend of closures and contractions. And that's not a pregnancy pun, by the way. That's all from us for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week looking back at more of the week's news and media. And if you have any thoughts to share or ideas for us to follow up, or you spot anything you think we should know about, get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you will also find us at MediawatchNZ on X. And you can even write us an old-fashioned letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. Hayden Donnell will be back next Wednesday with Midweek Media Watch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.